I found the letter on a Tuesday afternoon in March, tucked inside an old recipe box that smelled of cinnamon and thyme. My grandmother had been gone for 3 months by then, my grandfather for nearly a year before her. The house was quiet as I sorted through their things, deciding what to keep and what to let go. That's when I saw it, a cream-colored envelope with my grandfather's handwriting on the front. Just 2 words, the will. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. I wasn't supposed to find this. I could feel it in my bones, the way you know when you've stumbled onto something that was meant to stay hidden. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind they use for important documents. I sat down at their old kitchen table, the one where I'd eaten countless Sunday dinners, and I opened it. The first line made my heart stop. It is our intention that Thomas Michael Bradford, our son, receive nothing from our estate. Thomas Michael Bradford, my father. I read it again and again. The words didn't change. My grandparents, the people who raised me every summer, who taught me to make pie crust and tie my shoes, who kissed my forehead and called me their sunshine. They had planned to cut my father out completely, not reduce his inheritance, not split things differently, nothing. They wanted him to have nothing. I sat there for a long time, listening to the clock tick on the wall, the same clock that had ticked through every meal, every birthday, every quiet evening of my childhood. Outside, the March wind rattled the windows. Inside, everything I thought I knew about my family began to crack open like an egg, revealing something raw and complicated underneath. The letter went on for 3 pages, legal language mixed with personal notes, reasons, justifications, a whole secret history I'd never known about. And at the bottom, in my grandmother's shaky handwriting, just 1 line added in blue ink. God forgive us, but we cannot forgive him. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, holding this piece of paper that changed everything, wondering how I'd never seen it, how I'd missed the tension that must have been there all along, hidden beneath Sunday roasts and polite conversation, how love and hurt can exist in the same house, at the same table, and a child can grow up never knowing the difference. That was the moment everything shifted. That was when I started seeing my family's story, not the one I'd been told, but the real one, the complicated one, the one that's taken me years to understand. And I need to tell you about it now because keeping secrets is what started all of this in the first place.
My name is Charlotte, though everyone's always called me Charlie. I'm 38 now, but this story really begins long before I was born. Back when my father was young and my grandparents' house was full of different kinds of hope. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows your business and your grandmother's business and probably your great-grandmother's business too. My father owned a hardware store on Main Street, Bradford Hardware, established 1982. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. He sold nails and paint and garden hoses, and he knew every customer by name. My mother worked part-time at the library. We lived in a blue house with white shutters, and in the summer, my mother planted petunias in the window boxes. It was a simple life, a good life. At least, that's what I thought. My grandparents lived 10 minutes away, in the house where my father grew up. It was a bigger place, older, with a wraparound porch and a garden that my grandmother tended like it was her 5th child. There were 4 children altogether. My father was the oldest, then Aunt Linda, Uncle James, and Aunt Beth. By the time I came along, they were all scattered. Linda in Ohio, James in North Carolina, Beth in Seattle. Only my father had stayed in town. I spent every summer at my grandparents' house. Not because my parents needed a break or couldn't manage me, but because that's just what we did. It was tradition. From June until August, I'd pack my little suitcase with shorts and t-shirts and my favorite stuffed rabbit, and my father would drive me down Maple Street to that big old house with the porch. My grandmother would be waiting at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, smiling like I was the best thing she'd seen all year. "There's my sunshine," she'd say, and she'd pull me into a hug that smelled like lavender soap and vanilla extract. My grandfather would be in his chair by the window, reading the newspaper, and he'd fold it down and wink at me. "Charlie girl, ready for another summer of mischief?" Those summers were golden. That's the only word I have for them. My grandmother taught me to bake, apple pies, sugar cookies, her famous lemon bars that won first place at the county fair 3 years running. We'd stand at the kitchen counter, flour dusting our hands, and she'd tell me stories about when she was young, about meeting my grandfather at a church social, about raising 4 kids in that house. My grandfather taught me other things: how to identify birds by their calls, how to play gin rummy, how to fix a leaky faucet and change a tire, and all the practical things he said a person ought to know. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies, and he'd smoke his pipe and tell me about the stars. I loved them completely. Uncomplicated love, the kind you have when you're young and you don't know yet that people can hold contradictions inside themselves, that someone can be kind to you and cruel to someone else, that love doesn't always look the same from every angle. My father would visit every Sunday. He'd drive over after church and we'd all have dinner together: pot roast or fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden. My mother would come too, and we'd sit around that big dining room table, passing dishes and talking about nothing important: the weather, the hardware store, who was getting married or having a baby or moving away. I remember those dinners as warm, pleasant, normal. But now looking back, I can see the spaces between the words. The way my father would go quiet sometimes when my grandfather talked about the business or the house or plans for the future. The way my grandmother would change the subject quickly if anyone mentioned money or inheritance or who would take care of what when they were gone. I remember one Sunday when I was maybe 10 years old. My grandfather was talking about fixing up the garden shed, and he said something about leaving it in good shape for whoever ends up with this place. My father had set down his fork very carefully and said, "I suppose you'll decide that when you're ready." There was a pause, just a beat of silence that felt heavier than it should have. Then my grandmother had stood up quickly and said, "Who wants pie?" And the moment passed. I didn't think about it at the time. I was 10. I wanted pie. But that's how it was, I think. Little moments of tension smoothed over quickly, buried under dessert and small talk. A family that had learned to step around certain subjects the way you step around loose boards on an old porch. You know they're there. You just don't put your weight on them. My father never talked about his childhood much. When I asked him what it was like growing up in that big house, he'd shrug and say, "It was fine, normal." When I asked if he missed his brother and sisters, he'd say, "Sure, but that's life. People move on." He wasn't bitter, at least he didn't seem bitter. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who showed up every day and did what needed doing. He opened the hardware store every morning at 8. He coached my softball team. He fixed things around the house on weekends. He kissed my mother goodbye every morning and hello every evening. He was a good father, a good husband, a good man. And I never questioned why he was the only one of 4 children who stayed in town, why he was the one who visited his parents every single Sunday, who mowed their lawn and shoveled their driveway and fixed their broken appliances, while his siblings sent out Christmas cards and occasional phone calls from hundreds of miles away. I never questioned it because I didn't know I should. My mother knew something, though. I realize that now. There were times when she'd get a certain look on her face during those Sunday dinners, a tightness around her mouth that I didn't understand. Times when she'd suggest we skip a week, say we needed some family time at home, and my father would shake his head and say, "No, we should go. They're expecting us." Once when I was maybe 15, I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. My mother's voice was low but sharp. "Tom, you don't owe them every Sunday of your life." He said, "They're my parents. They're your parents who..." She stopped then because she'd seen me in the doorway. "Hey, sweetie," she'd said, her voice suddenly bright. "Want to help me with dinner?" I'd nodded and come in, and whatever she was about to say stayed unsaid.
That was the thing about my family. We were good at not saying things. We were experts at it. My grandfather died first, the winter I turned 35. Heart attack, quick and clean, the way he would have wanted it. We buried him on a cold January day, and my grandmother held my hand at the funeral and didn't cry once. She was made of stronger stuff than tears, or that's what I thought then. After he was gone, she seemed smaller somehow. She still kept the house immaculate, still tended her garden when spring came, but there was a loneliness in her that I could feel. I started visiting more often, just stopping by after work to check on her, to sit and have tea and talk about small things. She never talked about my grandfather much. When I asked if she missed him, she'd nod and say, "Every day, sunshine, every single day." But she wouldn't elaborate, wouldn't tell stories about their life together. It was like she'd closed a door in her mind and locked it tight. She died in her sleep the following December, exactly 11 months after my grandfather. The doctors said it was a stroke, but I think it was just time. I think she'd held on as long as she needed to, and then she let go. We had the funeral on a gray, cold morning. All 4 of her children came, my father, Linda, James, and Beth, together in the same room for the first time in years. They were polite to each other, distant, like cousins at a reunion rather than siblings who'd grown up in the same house. After the service, we gathered at the house to go through things, to divide up belongings and figure out logistics. That's when the lawyer showed up with the official will, the real will, the one that had been filed and notarized and made legal. It split everything 4 ways: the house, the savings, the investments, divided equally among all 4 children, fair and square. My father looked relieved. He actually smiled just a little and squeezed my mother's hand. "See," he said quietly, "it's fine. Everything's fine." But 3 months later, when I was alone in that house sorting through the final boxes, when I found that letter in the recipe box, that's when I learned that everything wasn't fine at all. That's when I learned my grandparents had planned something very different, that somewhere along the line they'd changed their minds or lost their nerve or been convinced by someone to do the right thing. And that's when I started looking for the rest of the story, the parts I'd never been told, the parts that explained why 2 people who loved their oldest son enough to see him every Sunday would also plan to cut him out of their lives even after death. I needed to understand. I needed to know what had happened in my family, in that house full of golden summers and silent tensions that could create such a secret. So I started asking questions. I started digging. And what I found broke my heart in ways I'm still trying to mend.
The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to read it again. I'd take it out of the envelope, unfold the pages, and then fold them back up, my hands shaking. I made tea I didn't drink. I paced my apartment. I called my mother twice and hung up before she answered. Finally, on the 4th day, I sat down with the notebook and I read the whole thing, slowly, taking notes like I was studying for an exam I desperately didn't want to take. The letter was dated April 2019, nearly 4 years before my grandfather died. It was written in legal language mostly, but there were handwritten notes in the margins in my grandfather's distinctive scrawl. And that line at the bottom from my grandmother, the one about forgiveness, was dated just 2 months before my grandfather's death. The document outlined their wishes clearly. The house, the investments, the life insurance, the savings, all of it was to be divided among Linda, James, and Beth. My father's name appeared only once, in that first terrible sentence about receiving nothing. But it was the handwritten notes that destroyed me. The reasons, the justifications. Thomas made his choice, my grandfather had written. He knew what he was doing. We gave him every opportunity, another note said. He threw it away. And then, most painful of all, some disappointments you can't forgive, even if you want to. I sat there staring at those words until they blurred. Some disappointments you can't forgive. What disappointment? What had my father done that was so terrible, so unforgivable, that his own parents wanted to erase him from their legacy? The man I knew was boring in the best way. He paid his bills on time. He'd been married to my mother for 40 years. He'd run the same hardware store for decades. He helped his neighbors. He fixed things. He showed up. What could he possibly have done? I knew I couldn't ask him directly. Not yet. Not until I understood more. So I did what I probably shouldn't have done. I started investigating my own family, like they were strangers. I began with Aunt Linda. She was the closest geographically, just a 3-hour drive away in Cleveland. I called her on a Saturday morning and asked if I could visit. She sounded surprised but pleased. "Of course, Charlie. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I lied. "I just want to see you. It's been too long." Her house was neat and modern, all clean lines and neutral colors. She made coffee, and we sat in her living room catching up on surface things, her job at the insurance company, her daughter's college plans, the garden she was planning for spring. Then I pulled out a photo I'd brought with me. It was an old one from the 70s, showing all 4 siblings as children. My father couldn't have been more than 12. He was smiling, his arm around Linda's shoulders. "I found a bunch of old photos at the house," I said, handing it to her. "You guys look so happy." Linda took the photo, and her expression changed, softened. She ran her finger over the image of my father's young face. "She were," she said quietly. "Once upon a time." I waited. I'd learned that silence was sometimes the best question. "Tommy was the best big brother," Linda said, still looking at the photo. "He looked out for all of us. When I was in 8th grade and this boy was bothering me, Tommy had a talk with him. Nothing violent, just talk to him, and the boy never bothered me again. That was Tommy. He took care of things." "What changed?" I asked softly. Linda looked up at me. Her eyes were sad. "You really don't know the story?" "I don't know anything."
Nobody ever told me anything.
She sighed and set the photo down on the coffee table. I suppose you have a right to know. You're old enough, and they're all gone now anyway. She got up and refilled our coffee cups, and I waited, my heart pounding. Your father was engaged before he met your mother, Linda began. Her name was Catherine Bailey, Katie. They were high school sweethearts, got engaged right after graduation. Mom and Dad loved her, absolutely loved her. She was from a good family. Her father owned the bank in town. She was smart and pretty and everything they wanted for Tommy. I felt like I'd been slapped. My father had been engaged to someone else. I'd never heard even a whisper of this. They had the wedding all planned. Big church wedding, reception at the country club, the works. Mom had already bought her dress. Dad was going to give them the down payment on the house as a wedding gift. The whole family was invested in this marriage. What happened? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. 3 weeks before the wedding, Tommy called it off. The words hung in the air between us. Just like that? I said. Just like that. He told Katie he couldn't marry her. He gave back the ring. He canceled everything. It was a huge scandal in town. You have to understand, this was 1978, and the Baileys were important people. Katie was humiliated. Her father was furious. The whole town talked about it for months. But why? I asked. Why did he call it off? Linda looked at me for a long moment. Because he'd met your mother. I set down my coffee cup carefully. Mom? Your mother had just moved to town. She was working as a substitute teacher. Tommy met her at the library one day. He'd gone to pick up a book he'd reserved, and she was there browsing the poetry section. They started talking, and that was it. He fell in love with her right there, between the shelves. So he broke off his engagement, I said slowly. He broke off his engagement 3 weeks before the wedding, after his parents had spent thousands of dollars on deposits, after the whole town had been invited, after Katie had picked out her dress and the bridesmaids had their fittings. He destroyed that poor girl's life because he met someone at the library and decided she was his soulmate? Linda's voice had gotten harder as she talked. I could hear the old anger in it, still fresh after all these years. Mom and Dad were devastated, not just because of the money, though that was significant, but because of what it said about Tommy, that he could be so thoughtless, so selfish, that he could hurt people that way and think love was an excuse for it. Did they ever forgive him? I asked. They tried. Your mother was nice enough. They couldn't really find fault with her except that she existed at the wrong time. And when you came along, when you were born, they loved you so much. They were your first grandchild. But the thing with Mom and Dad was, they never forgot. They smiled and played nice, but they never forgot what Tommy did, and they never trusted him the same way again. I felt sick. So that's why they wanted to disinherit him? Linda shrugged. I mean, I know they were angry for years, but to cut him out completely, that seems extreme, even for them. What if I told you they planned to do exactly that? Linda stared at me. What? I told her about the letter, about finding it in the recipe box, about the language and the handwritten notes, and my grandmother's words about forgiveness. Linda went pale. Oh my God, I had no idea. I mean, I knew they favored the rest of us, but I never thought... She stopped, shook her head. Actually, that's not true. There were hints, little things Mom would say, about making sure we were taken care of, about Tommy having...
Did James and Beth know? I asked. I don't know. We don't talk about Tommy much when we get together. It's an uncomfortable subject. Because he stayed and you all left? Because he stayed and we all left, Linda confirmed. And because he was always trying so hard, you know, coming to every Sunday dinner, helping with every little thing, being the perfect son. It was exhausting to watch. and it made the rest of us look bad, even though we'd moved on with our lives like normal people do. She walked to the window and looked out at her neat suburban street. I'll tell you something I've never told anyone. About 5 years ago, I came home for Christmas. Tommy was there with your mom, and you couldn't make it. You were traveling with your boyfriend, I think. And on Christmas Eve, after everyone else had gone to bed, I came downstairs for water and found Tommy in the kitchen. He was just sitting there in the dark, and he'd been crying. My breath caught. I'd never seen my father cry, not once in my entire life. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "I just want them to love me again the way they used to. Just once. Just one day where I'm not the son who disappointed them." And then he wiped his face and apologized for being emotional. He actually apologized to me for having feelings. Tommy turned back to me and her eyes were wet. I didn't know what to say to him, so I said nothing. I got my water and I went back to bed. And I've felt guilty about that ever since. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, a neighbor was mowing their lawn. Inside, the coffee had gone cold. "There's more," Linda said finally. "There has to be more. Because what Tommy did was wrong, yes, but it wasn't unforgivable. People break engagements. People fall in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. It happens. Mom and Dad were upset, but they weren't cruel people. They wouldn't have held that grudge for 40 years unless something else happened." "What else could there be?" I asked. "I don't know, but if I were you, I'd talk to Beth. She's the youngest. She was always Mom's confidant. If anyone knows the full story, it's her." I left Linda's house with more questions than answers and a headache that felt like someone was pressing on my skull. I drove home in a daze, trying to reconcile what the story I just heard with the father I knew. He'd broken someone's heart. He'd embarrassed his family. He chose love over obligation, and his parents had never forgiven him. But was that enough to justify what I'd found in that letter? Was loving my mother worth 40 years of quiet punishment? That night, I called Beth in Seattle. It was late there, but she answered on the second ring. "Charlie, is everything okay?" "I need to know about Dad," I said without preamble. "I need to know what really happened. All of it." There was a long pause. "Linda called me. She said you found a letter. So you knew they were going to cut him out." "I knew they were angry," Beth said carefully. "I didn't know about a letter." "Please," I said, and my voice broke. "Please just tell me the truth. What did he do that was so terrible?" Beth was quiet for so long, I thought she might have hung up. Then she sighed, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. "It wasn't just Katie," she said. "That was bad, but you're right, it wasn't enough. What happened was after you were born, you were maybe 6 months old. Dad got sick. Your grandfather, I mean. He had cancer, prostate cancer. They caught it early, but he needed surgery and then treatment, and he was going to be out of commission for months. I didn't know he had cancer because he survived it. But at the time, it was serious, and Dad owned a business, a construction company, small but successful. He needed someone to run it while he was recovering. James was too young, still in college. I was just a kid. Linda had just gotten married and moved away. So Dad asked Tommy. My heart started beating faster. Tommy said no. The words hit me like a physical blow. He said he couldn't leave the hardware store, that he just opened it and it was a critical time, that he had you and your mother to take care of. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't do it. He recommended Dad hire a manager instead, someone professional. What happened to the business? I asked, though I already knew. The manager Dad hired embezzled from the company. Not a lot at first, but over the months Dad was sick,
This guy siphoned off nearly $50,000. By the time Dad was well enough to come back to work and discovered what happened, the guy had disappeared. They never recovered the money, and the business never really recovered either. Dad had to take out loans, sell equipment, lay off workers. It nearly bankrupted them. Beth's voice was thick now, and the whole time, Tommy was right there in town, running his own business successfully, visiting every Sunday like nothing was wrong. Mom and Dad were furious. They felt betrayed. They felt like when they really needed him, their oldest son, the one they'd raised to be responsible and take care of family, he'd chosen himself instead. But he had a new baby, I whispered. He had me. I know, Beth said. I've never agreed with how they treated him after that. I thought they were too harsh. But Charlie, you have to understand, from their perspective, Tommy had already proven once that he'd put his own feelings ahead of everyone else's when he left Katie. And then, when they really needed him, when Dad was sick and scared and needed help, Tommy said no again. It confirmed everything they feared about him, that he was selfish, that he couldn't be counted on, that he'd always choose his own comfort over family loyalty. I was crying now, silently, tears streaming down my face. They loved you so much. You were innocent in all of this, and I think they wanted to have a relationship with Tommy for your sake, but they never forgave him. They never forgot, and apparently they planned to make sure he knew it even after they were gone. Except they didn't, I said. The real will split everything equally. Then someone convinced them to change it. Maybe the lawyer, maybe one of us, maybe they just realized that continuing the punishment after death was too cruel. I don't know, but I'm not surprised they wrote that first letter. I'm only surprised they didn't follow through. After we hung up, I sat on my couch in the dark and tried to breathe. I felt like I was drowning in information, in perspectives, in competing truths. My father had broken an engagement 3 weeks before a wedding. He'd fallen in love with someone else and followed his heart instead of honoring his commitment. My father had refused to help his own father run the family business when his father had cancer. He said no when his family needed him most, and that decision had cost them everything. My father had spent 40 years trying to make up for these choices, 40 years of Sunday dinners and lawn mowing and being the perfect son to parents who smiled at him but never forgave him. And my grandparents, the people who taught me to bake and play cards and look at stars, they loved me completely while planning to punish my father from beyond the grave. How could all of these things be true at the same time? I needed to talk to my father. I needed to hear his side of the story, but I was terrified of what that conversation might do to him, to me, to us.
So instead, I did what I probably should have done first. I went to see my mother. She was in her garden when I arrived, wearing her old sun hat and gloves, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. She looked up when she heard my car and smiled, but the smile faded when she saw my face. "Charlie, what's wrong?" I handed her the letter without saying a word. She wiped her hands on her jeans and took it. I watched her face as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands start to shake. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. "So you know," she said quietly. "You knew about this?" "Not about the letter specifically, but I knew how they felt about your father. I've always known." She took off her gloves and sat down on the garden bench. I sat beside her. Around us, the tomatoes grew on their stakes, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Your father broke his engagement to marry me," she said. "Did they tell you that?" Linda told me. "He shouldn't have done it that way. He should have called things off with Katie before he pursued anything with me. I told him that. I tried to walk away, but he was so sure, Charlie. He was so absolutely certain that I was the person he was supposed to spend his life with, and I felt the same way. I've never regretted marrying your father, not for one single day, but I've regretted the pain it caused other people. I've carried that guilt for 40 years. Mom, and when your grandfather got sick, when he asked your father to run the business, your father and I talked about it for weeks. We barely slept. You were so little, and the hardware store was barely breaking even. If your father had closed it to go work for his dad, we would have lost everything we'd built. We had a mortgage. We had you. We were terrified. Her voice broke. But we weren't just thinking about ourselves. Your grandfather's business was failing already. He'd made bad decisions, extended credit to people who couldn't pay, taken on projects that lost money. Your father looked at the books and realized that even if he ran the business perfectly, it might not survive. He would have sacrificed our livelihood for something that was already dying. But the embezzlement would have happened whether your father was running things or not. That manager was a con artist. He'd done the same thing at other companies. The police told us that later. If your father had been there, the guy would have just stolen in different ways. But your grandparents never saw it like that. They saw it as your father's fault, as proof that he was selfish. She wiped her eyes. I wanted us to move away, to go somewhere your father could start fresh, where his parents' disappointment wouldn't follow him everywhere, but he refused. He said he needed to stay. He needed to prove to them that he was a good man, a good son, even if they never believed it. So we stayed, and I've watched him try to earn their love back for 40 years, knowing they'd never give it to him. Not really. Why didn't you tell me any of this? I asked. Because you loved them, because they loved you, because your childhood was happy, and why should you carry the weight of adult mistakes and old grudges? You deserved to have grandparents who were just grandparents, not complicated people with complicated histories. We sat there together in the garden, in the smell of tomato plants and fresh earth, and I understood for the first time how much my mother had protected me, how much she had swallowed and smiled through and carried alone so that I could have those golden summers. I need to talk to Dad, I said finally. I know, my mother replied. But Charlie, be gentle. He spent his whole life believing he failed his parents. This letter will break his heart. Should I even show it to him? My mother thought about that. I don't know, she said honestly. Part of me says no. Let him believe they forgave him in the end. Let him think the equal inheritance meant they'd come around. But part of me thinks he deserves the truth, that maybe the truth, as painful as it is better than wondering.
What would you do? She looked at me with tired, kind eyes. I'd tell him, because secrets are what caused all of this in the first place, and because your father is stronger than everyone gives him credit for. He's been carrying this weight for 40 years. Maybe it's time to finally set it down. That evening, I called my father and asked if I could come over. He said, yes, of course. Come for dinner. My mother would make her chicken casserole. But I said no, just him. I needed to talk to just him. There was a pause. Then he said okay. He'd be home tomorrow afternoon. Come by after the store closed. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, holding that letter, wondering if I was about to destroy my father's peace or set him free. I arrived at my parents' house at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening. The sun was still up, casting long shadows across the yard. My father's truck was in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see him sitting at the table, waiting. My mother met me at the door. She squeezed my hand, but didn't say anything. Then she picked up her purse and car keys. "I'm going to the library," she said. "Take your time." She kissed my father on the cheek as she passed through the kitchen, and then it was just the two of us. My father looked older than I'd ever noticed before. He was 65 now, his hair completely gray, lines deep around his eyes. He'd worked hard his whole life. It showed in his hands, in the way he held himself, and the tiredness that seemed to live in his shoulders. "Coffee?" he asked. "Sure." He got up and poured 2 cups, added cream to mine the way I'd liked it since I was 16. We sat across from each other at the same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, the table where I'd done homework and played board games and told my parents about my day, every day, for 18 years. "You look worried," my father said. "What's going on, Charlie?" I took a breath. Then I pulled the letter from my bag and slid it across the table. "I found this at Grandma and Grandpa's house, in the recipe box." My father looked at the envelope. I watched recognition cross his face. He knew his father's handwriting. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. "Maybe you shouldn't," I started to say. But he'd already opened it. He was already reading. I watched my father's face as he read the letter that said his parents had planned to erase him from their lives. I watched him take in every word, every handwritten note, every cold legal phrase. I watched him read his mother's line about forgiveness at the bottom. He read it once, then again. Then he carefully folded it and put it back in the envelope and set it down on the table. His hands were shaking harder now. "Dad, so they didn't do it though," he said. His voice was steady, carefully controlled. The actual will was different. They changed their minds. "Yes, but so this doesn't matter. This was just something they considered and decided against, that's all." "Dad, please. I should start dinner. Your mother will be hungry when she gets back." He stood up abruptly, but I caught his wrist. "Dad, stop. Please. We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. It's an old letter that doesn't mean anything because they changed their minds. End of story." "It's not the end. I know about Katie. I know about Grandpa's business. I know everything." My father went very still. Then slowly, he sat back down. He looked at the table, at his hands, anywhere but at me. "Who told you?" "Linda, Beth." Mom filled in the rest. He nodded slowly. "So you know what a disappointment I was." "That's not what I know. What I know is that you fell in love with the wrong person at the wrong time, and you made a choice. And then you made another hard choice when Grandpa was sick, and your parents never forgave you for either one." "They had every right not to forgive me," my father said. His voice was getting rougher now, emotion pushing through. "Katie didn't deserve what I did to her. And my father, he needed me, Charlie. He had cancer. He was scared. And I said no. Because you had a baby. Because you had a business that would have failed. Because I was a coward, my father said, and now his voice broke completely. Because I didn't want to sacrifice what I'd built. Because I chose myself over my family, just like I did with Katie. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. No, I said firmly. That's not who you are. That's who they convinced you that you were. My father looked at me then, really looked at me, and his eyes were full of tears. You don't understand. You don't know what it was like. Growing up in that house, being the oldest, having all these expectations. I was supposed to be perfect. I was supposed to do everything right. And the first real choice I made for myself, the first time I followed my own heart instead of their plan, I destroyed everything. I humiliated Katie. I embarrassed my parents. I proved I couldn't be trusted. You proved you were human, I said. And then with the business, Charlie, my father called me from the hospital. He'd just had surgery. He was in pain and scared, and he asked me to help him, and I said no. What kind of son does that? His voice had risen. 40 years of guilt was pouring out now, 40 years of carrying this weight alone. A son who had his own family to protect, I said. A son who looked at a failing business and knew he couldn't save it. A son who made a hard choice and has been punishing himself for it ever since. I should have tried, my father said. I should have found a way. You should have been forgiven, I interrupted. That's what should have happened. You made hard choices, choices that hurt people, and you've spent 40 years trying to make amends. You showed up every Sunday, you mowed their lawn, you fixed their house, you brought them their granddaughter every summer, you loved them even when they couldn't love you back, and that should have been enough. My father put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. I'd never seen him cry before, and watching it happen now was like watching a dam break after holding back water for decades. I got up and went to him. I put my arms around him the way he'd held me when I was little, when I'd fallen off my bike or failed a test or had my heart broken. I held him while he cried, while 40 years of trying to be good enough finally broke open. They loved you, I said softly. In their own complicated way, they did love you. They just didn't know how to forgive you, and that was their failure, Dad, not yours. They planned to give me nothing, he said, his voice muffled. Even after everything, they wanted to punish me forever. But they didn't. They changed the will. They chose differently in the end. Or someone made them change it. Does it matter? I asked. Either way, they didn't follow through. Either they found mercy or someone helped them find it. Either way, you're not disinherited. You're not erased. You're still their son. My father lifted his head. His face was wet, his eyes red. I wanted them to be proud of me. Just once. I wanted them to look at me and not see the son who disappointed them. I think they were proud, I said softly. I think underneath all the hurt and stubbornness and old anger, they were proud of you. You stayed. You built a life. You raised a daughter. You were faithful to your community and your own family. You were a good man, Dad. You are a good man. Then why does this hurt so much? He asked, gesturing to the letter. Because you deserved better, I said simply. You deserved parents who could see past their hurt to all the good you did. You deserved to not spend your whole life trying to earn back love that should have been given freely. You deserved grace. We sat there together as the light faded outside. My father held the letter in his hands, looking at it like he was trying to memorize every word. Your mother knew how they felt, he said finally. She always knew, and she stayed anyway. She sat through 40 years of Sunday dinners, watching my parents treat me like I was on probation. Do you know how many times she suggested we move? Start over somewhere else. I told her. I wouldn't go. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, did more, was better, they'd come around, they'd forgive me. I'd see it in their eyes one day, that forgiveness, that acceptance. He laughed, a bitter sound. I was 50 years old and still trying to please my parents. How pathetic is that? It's not pathetic. It's love. Complicated, painful, exhausting love, but love nonetheless.
My father will never have the relationship with his parents that he wanted. That door is closed now, blocked by death and missed chances. But he has peace, or something close to it. He has a life he's built, a wife who's loved him through everything, a daughter who sees him clearly and loves him completely. He has enough. And I'm learning that enough is not a small thing. Enough is actually everything when you stop measuring it against some impossible standard of perfection. So here's what I want you to know. If you're listening to this story and seeing pieces of your own family in it, people are complicated. They will love you and disappoint you. They will give you gifts and withhold others. They will be kind and cruel, generous and petty, forgiving and stubborn, sometimes in the same day. And that's okay. That's human. You can love them anyway. You can love them while also being honest about the hurt they caused. You can honor what they gave you while grieving what they couldn't give. You can forgive them for being imperfect while also not excusing the damage they did. You can hold all of it, the gratitude and the anger, the love and the disappointment, the beautiful memories and the painful truths. Because that's what it means to be part of a family. Not to pretend everything was perfect, but to accept it all as real. To make peace with the mess of it. To learn from the mistakes and try to do better with your own life, your own relationships, your own chances to love and forgive. My grandparents planned to disinherit my father, and then they changed their minds, or someone changed it for them. Either way, that story could have destroyed our family. It could have become the only thing we remembered, the only truth we told. But instead, it became part of a larger story, a more complete one that includes golden summers and Sunday dinners and learning to make pie, one that includes broken engagements and unforgiveness and quiet suffering, one that includes apologies spoken too late and letters written but never sent, and love that couldn't find its way past pride. All of it. The whole complicated, painful, beautiful truth. And somehow, despite everything, we're okay. We're healing. We're learning. We're still a family. The sun is setting now. Through the kitchen window, I can see my grandmother's garden, full of flowers I planted this spring. New blooms in old soil. The same, but different. That's what we are, I think. The same, but different. Carrying the past, but not trapped by it. Honoring the people who came before while choosing to live differently. I'm making pie tonight. Apple with a lattice crust, just the way my grandmother taught me. And tomorrow, my father and I are going to sit on this porch and eat it together. And we're going to talk about normal things and laugh about nothing important. And that will be enough. More than enough. It will be everything.
And Charlie, thank you for finding this, for showing it to me, for caring enough to want to understand. Your mother and I, we tried to protect you from all this ugliness. We wanted you to have grandparents you could love without complications. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe the truth is better. Maybe both things are true, I said. Maybe I needed the uncomplicated love when I was young, and I needed the truth now. Maybe it all happened the way it was supposed to. He hugged me then, tight and long. I love you, Charlie. You're the best thing I ever did. The one thing I got completely right. I love you too, Dad. I drove home through the dark, feeling exhausted and raw and strangely hopeful. The truth was painful. The truth was complicated. But the truth was also freeing. My father had spent 40 years carrying guilt and trying to earn forgiveness. And maybe he'd never fully let go of that weight. Maybe some disappointments live in your bones forever. But at least now, it was named. It was seen. It was real. And sometimes that's the first step toward healing. Saturday morning came cool and gray, the kind of early spring day that can't decide if it wants to rain. My father picked me up at 7. We drove to the cemetery in silence, the letter in my bag between us. The cemetery was empty, except for a groundskeeper in the distance. We walked across the wet grass to my grandparents' graves. 2 headstones, side by side, with their names and dates and the words, "Together forever," carved beneath. My father stood there looking at those stones for a long time. I used to come here every week. After they died, I'd bring flowers, I'd tell them about the store, about your mom, about you. I'd talk to them like they could hear me, like they cared. Maybe they could. Maybe they did. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. I took the letter from my bag. "Do you want to say anything?" My father looked at the graves. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but steady. "I'm sorry I wasn't the son you wanted. I'm sorry I disappointed you. But I'm not sorry I married Sarah. I'm not sorry for the life I built. I'm not sorry for choosing love over obligation, even though it hurt you. I wish I could have been both. The son you needed and the man I needed to be. But I couldn't. And I've carried that guilt for 40 years. So I'm giving it back to you now. I'm done trying to earn forgiveness I'll never receive. I'm done punishing myself for being human." He knelt down and started digging in the soft earth with his hands, right at the base of my grandmother's headstone. I knelt beside him and helped. We dug a small hole, maybe 6 inches deep. My father took the letter from me. He looked at it one more time, at his father's handwriting, at his mother's words about forgiveness. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the hole. We covered it with earth, patted it down, made it smooth. Rest in peace, both of you. And let me rest too. We stood up, brushed the dirt from our hands. Around us, the cemetery was waking up, birds singing, the sun trying to break through the clouds. "How do you feel?"
"I know," he said, "and that's going to have to be enough." We walked back to the truck together. Behind us, the letter lay buried in the earth, a secret returned to its keepers. The graves sat silent in the morning light, holding all the complicated truths that families carry. And for the first time in 40 years, my father walked away from them without looking back. The weeks after we buried the letter felt like learning to breathe differently. My father seemed quieter, more thoughtful, but there was something else too, a kind of peace I'd never seen in him before. Like he'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. My mother noticed it too. She called me one evening about 3 weeks after our cemetery visit. "He's different," she said. He's sleeping better. And yesterday, when Mrs. Patterson came into the store complaining about the paint we sold her, you know how she does, he just smiled and said, "I'm sorry it didn't work out for you, Mrs. Patterson, but I'm not going to argue about it today. Life's too short." And then he gave her a refund and went back to work. The old Tom would have spent 20 minutes explaining why the paint was fine and she'd used it wrong. "That's good, right?" I asked. "It's wonderful," my mother said, "but it's also strange. It's like something broke open in him, or maybe broke off. I don't know how to describe it." I knew what she meant. My father had spent 40 years trying to be perfect, trying to prove his worth. Now, suddenly, he'd stopped. He was just being, existing without constantly measuring himself against an impossible standard. But I was struggling. I couldn't stop thinking about my grandparents. Every memory I had was colored now with this new knowledge. I'd pull out a photo from those summer visits and wonder, when this was taken, were they already planning to disinherit my father? When my grandmother was teaching me to make pie crust, was she thinking about how her son had disappointed her? When my grandfather was showing me the stars, was he holding on to anger even as he held my hand? I couldn't reconcile it. The people who'd loved me so completely and the people who'd planned such cruelty, they lived in the same bodies, in the same memories. How could both be true? I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Reeves, and she had kind eyes and an office that smelled like lavender. I told her everything, about finding the letter, about learning my family's history, about feeling like I'd lost something I couldn't name. "You're grieving," she said simply. "You're grieving the grandparents you thought you had. And that's valid, even though they were never really different people. Your perception of them changed, and that's a loss." "But they were good to me," I said. "Everything they gave me was real. The love was real." "Yes," Dr. Reeves agreed, "and so was the cruelty toward your father. People contain multitudes. They can be generous and petty, loving and unforgiving, kind and cruel, sometimes all at once. That's the hardest lesson about being human. Nobody is just one thing." So how do I forgive them? How do I keep the good memories without feeling like I'm betraying my father? Do you think you're betraying your father? I thought about that. I don't know. He went through 40 years trying to earn their love, and I just got it for free. I didn't have to do anything except be born. It feels unfair. It is unfair. You're allowed to feel that. And you're also allowed to be grateful for the love you received. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. But how do I hold both? How do I love them and be angry at them at the same time? By understanding that love isn't simple. By accepting that the people who hurt your father are the same people who loved you. By letting yourself feel all of it, the gratitude and the anger, the love and the disappointment. You don't have to choose. I cried in her office that day. Big, messy tears for the grandparents I'd lost, for the father who had suffered, for the simplicity of childhood that you can never get back once you see the complicated truth underneath. But slowly, over the following weeks, something started to shift. I began to separate what my grandparents did from who they were to me. I could acknowledge that they'd treated my father unfairly, while still treasuring the summers they gave me. I could be angry about the letter, while still feeling grateful for the pie recipes and the card games and the firefly evenings.
It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more complicated. It was holding space for paradox, for contradiction, for the messy reality that people can be both wonderful and terrible, sometimes in the same moment. I started talking to my father more. Real conversations, not just surface small talk. We'd meet for coffee on Saturday mornings, and I'd ask him questions I'd never asked before. "Did you love Katie?" I asked one morning, "before you met Mom?" My father stirred his coffee, thinking, I thought I did, but looking back,
I think I loved the idea of Katie more than Katie herself. She was what everyone expected, what I was supposed to want, and she was nice and pretty and easy to be with. But when I met your mother, he paused, smiled. When I met Sarah, I understood the difference between settling and choosing, between doing what you're supposed to do and doing what you can't not do. Do you regret how you handled it? Every day, he said. I was 20 years old and I handled it like a coward. I should have talked to Katie first before I pursued anything with your mother. I should have been honest. I hurt her badly and I'll always carry that. But I don't regret marrying my mother. I can't. Because if I regret that, I regret you. And you're the one thing in my life I'm absolutely certain about. Did you ever try to apologize to Katie? Years later, yes. I wrote her a letter, told her I was sorry for how I'd handled things, that she deserved better. I didn't make excuses. I just apologized. He took a sip of his coffee. She never wrote back, and I don't blame her. Another Saturday, I asked about his father's business. Could you have saved it? I asked. If you'd said yes, if you'd run it while he was sick, could you have prevented what happened? My father was quiet for a long time. He finally said, I don't know. Maybe, but probably not. The business was already struggling. My father was a good builder, but a terrible businessman. He trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. He made decisions with his heart instead of his head. The embezzlement was just the final blow to something that was already dying. But you've always felt like you could have saved it. Yes, because even if I couldn't have saved the business, I could have been there. I could have helped him through the hardest time of his life, and I chose not to. I chose my own security over his need, and that's something I have to live with. Mom says you looked at it practically, that you had a family to support. I did, but practical is just another word for selfish when you're talking about family, isn't it? At least that's what my parents thought, and maybe they were right. Or maybe, I said carefully, everyone was a little bit right and a little bit wrong. Maybe there wasn't a perfect choice. Maybe you made the best decision you could with the information you had, and it still hurt people. Maybe that's just how life works sometimes. My father looked at me with something like wonder. When did you get so wise? I have a good therapist, and I'm learning that families are more complicated than I thought. That they are, Charlie girl. That they are. I also started reaching out to my aunts and uncle more. Linda and I talked on the phone every few weeks. She told me stories about growing up with my father, about how he'd been protective and responsible, and also sometimes bossy and overbearing in the way oldest siblings can be. He took care of us, she said. When Mom and Dad were fighting, and they fought sometimes, all parents do, Tommy would gather us up and take us outside. We'd build forts in the backyard or go for walks. He'd distract us. He made us feel safe. But you left. You all left town and never came back.
Because we could, Linda said. Because we weren't the oldest. We didn't have the same expectations on us. Tommy was supposed to stay, supposed to take over something, supposed to be the responsible one. We got to just live our lives. And maybe we felt guilty about that. Maybe that's why we stayed away. It was easier than watching him try so hard all the time. Beth told me about the last time she'd really talked to my father, about 5 years before my grandmother died. She'd come home for Thanksgiving, and late one night, they'd sat up talking. He asked me if I thought Mom and Dad would ever forgive him, Beth said. And I didn't know what to say, because I knew they hadn't, not really. But how do you tell your brother that? So I said something like, "They love you, Tommy. That's what matters." And he just looked at me and said, "Love isn't the same as forgiveness. I've learned that the hard way." She paused. I think about that conversation a lot, about how sad it is that he understood that truth so clearly.
Even Uncle James, who I barely knew, sent me a long email when he heard I'd been asking questions. He told me about watching my father take the blame for things that weren't his fault, just to keep the peace. About how my grandfather would criticize the hardware store, that little shop, he'd call it, and my father would just nod and change the subject. "Your dad has more grace than any person I've ever met," James wrote. He took their disappointment and their coldness and their conditional love, and he never stopped showing up, never stopped trying. I couldn't have done that. I had to leave because I couldn't stand watching it anymore. But Tommy stayed, and I've never known if that made him the bravest or the most foolish of all of us. All these conversations, all these pieces of the story helped me understand something important. My father wasn't a perfect victim, and my grandparents weren't perfect villains. Everyone had made choices. Everyone had hurt each other. Everyone had loved imperfectly and forgiven incompletely. And somehow, despite all of it, we'd been a family. A broken, complicated, messy family, but a family nonetheless. One evening in late spring, I went to my parents' house for dinner. My father was grilling in the backyard, and my mother was making a salad. I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching them move around each other with the ease of 40 years together. "Dad," I called out, "can I ask you something?" "Sure, honey." "Do you wish things had been different with Grandma and Grandpa?" He flipped a burger, thinking. "Yes and no. I wish they could have forgiven me. I wish we could have had the relationship I kept hoping for. But if things had been different, I might not have appreciated what I have. Your mother, you, this life we built. I spent so much time trying to earn my parents' approval that I forgot to notice I already had everything that mattered." He looked at my mother, who was watching him from the kitchen window. She smiled. He smiled back. He continued, "That's the thing about disappointment. It teaches you what's real. My parents' love was conditional. It depended on me being who they wanted me to be. But your mother's love, yours, that's been constant. Even when I mess up, even when I fail, even when I'm not the man I think I should be, you both love me anyway. And that's worth more than any inheritance." "They did love you, though," I said. "I really believe that." "I believe it too," my father said. "They just didn't know how to love me past their own hurt. And I've made peace with that, or I'm trying to, anyway. The therapist says it's okay to love them and be angry at them at the same time. Your therapist is smart, and she's right. I'm still angry. I might always be angry, but I'm also grateful. They gave you, in a way. Those summers you spent with them, the relationship you had, that was a gift. Even if they couldn't give me what I needed, they gave you something beautiful, and I'm thankful for that." Dinner that night was peaceful. We ate outside as the sun set, talking about easy things, the new employee at the hardware store, the book my mother was reading, plans for the garden, normal life continuing despite the weight of everything we'd learned. As I was leaving, my mother walked me to my car. "He's doing better," she said quietly. "Better than I've seen him in years. The letter hurt him, but it also freed him somehow. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," I said. "It does. Sometimes you need to see the worst clearly before you can let it go." "I was so angry when you first showed me that letter," my mother said. "I wanted to dig them up and yell at them. How dare they plan to punish him even after death? How dare they take a good man and make him feel worthless for 40 years? She shook her head. "But you know what? They didn't win. They tried to break him, tried to make him believe he was unworthy. And he just kept being kind, kept being faithful, kept showing up. They couldn't take that from him." "He learned that from you," I said. "We learned it from each other. That's what marriage is, honey. Learning together how to be better than you were yesterday, how to forgive when you're hurt, how to love when it's hard. Your father and I, we've had to do a lot of that over the years. Because of his parents? Because of life. His parents were part of it, but not all of it. We've had our own struggles, our own disappointments, but we chose each other every day, even on the days when choosing was difficult. And that's made all the difference. I hugged her tight. Thank you for taking care of him all these years. He's taking care of me too. That's how it works when it works right. I drove home feeling settled in a way I hadn't felt since finding the letter. The story of my family was complicated, full of hurt and love tangled together. But it was also a story of survival, of choosing to keep going even when forgiveness never came, of building something good out of disappointment. My grandparents had loved me completely and treated my father cruelly. My father had hurt people in his youth and spent his life trying to atone. My mother had stood by him through decades of quiet pain. My aunts and uncle had left rather than watch the slow heartbreak. All of it was true. All of it mattered. And none of it was simple. But here's what else was true. I was loved. My father was loved. We had each other. We had built lives that meant something despite the cracks in our foundation. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Because family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up imperfectly, over and over again, until the showing up becomes its own kind of grace. It's been 2 years since I found that letter in my grandmother's recipe box. 2 years since everything I thought I knew about my family shifted and rearranged itself into something more honest, more complicated, and ultimately more real. I'm in my grandmother's kitchen right now as I tell you this. Well, it's not her kitchen anymore. It's mine. When the estate was finally settled and the house divided equally among the 4 siblings, my father surprised everyone by buying out his siblings' shares. He said he wanted to keep it in the family, wanted it to stay a place where memories lived, but he didn't want to live here himself. Too many ghosts, he said. Too many years of trying and failing. So he gave it to me. Make new memories here, he told me when he handed me the keys. Happy ones, the kind that don't carry weight. I've been baking a lot lately, using my grandmother's recipes, the ones she taught me during those golden summers. Apple pie, lemon bars, sugar cookies. Every time I make them, I think about her hands guiding mine, her voice patient and warm. Just like that, sunshine, you're doing perfect. And I let myself remember those moments without guilt now. I let myself love her memory, even though I know the whole truth about who she was. She was flawed and stubborn and unable to forgive. She was also kind and generous and wonderful to me. Both things are true. Both things matter. I've learned that you can hold space for contradiction. You can love someone and be disappointed in them. You can be grateful for what they gave you while acknowledging what they withheld from others. You can honor the good parts while being honest about the painful parts. That's not betrayal. That's just truth. My father comes over for dinner once a week now, usually Thursdays. He brings wine and my mother brings flowers from her garden, and we sit around that old table and talk. Sometimes we talk about my grandparents, sometimes we don't. But there's a lightness to him now that wasn't there before, like he's finally stopped performing, stopped trying to earn something that was never going to come. Last Thursday, he told me something I'd never known. When your grandmother was dying, he said, I was with her at the end. Your mother and I sat with her through the night, and right before she went, she opened her eyes and looked at me, really looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time in years. and she said, "I'm sorry, Tommy. I'm so sorry." He paused, swirled the wine in his glass. I don't know what she was sorry for. Maybe everything. Maybe nothing specific. Maybe she was just making peace in the only way she could. But I held her hand and I said, "I forgive you, Mom. It's okay." And she closed her eyes and she was gone. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked. Because I wasn't sure it mattered. One apology doesn't erase 40 years. One moment of clarity doesn't undo decades of coldness. But now I think it does matter. Not because it changes the past, but because it means she saw it. At the end, she saw what she'd done, and she regretted it. That's something. "Do you really forgive her?" I asked. He thought about it. "I'm working on it. Some days I do, some days I'm still angry, but I'm not carrying it the same way anymore. It's not a weight I'm dragging everywhere. It's just part of my story. A sad part, but not the only part. That's healing, I think. Not erasing the hurt, but changing your relationship to it. Learning to carry it differently, or sometimes learning to set it down altogether. I've stayed in touch with my aunts and uncle. We're not close, not the way families in movies are close, but we're connected. We share memories, both good and difficult. We're learning to be honest with each other about what growing up in that house was really like, what being part of this family really meant. Linda told me recently that she's started seeing a therapist too. She said, "I'm realizing I have more to work through than I thought, about Mom and Dad, about leaving Tommy alone to deal with everything, about my own guilt and grief." Beth admitted she's always felt like the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and how that created its own kind of pressure. "They compared the others to me constantly," she said, "and I hated it. I didn't want to be the standard everyone else failed to meet." James said he's planning to visit this summer to see the house now that I've moved in. "I haven't been back in 15 years, he told me. "I think it's time." We're all doing our own work, carrying our own pieces of this family story. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe there's no neat resolution, no moment where everything makes sense and everyone feels better. Maybe it's just this: people trying, failing, trying again. People being honest about the hurt while still reaching for connection. I found something else in the house a few months ago. It was tucked in the back of my grandfather's desk drawer. A birthday card he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to my father for his 50th birthday. The outside just said "son" in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside, he'd written, "Tommy, I don't know how to say this out loud, so I'm writing it down. I'm proud of the man you've become. I'm proud of the business you built, the family you've raised, the life you've made. I know we've had our differences. I know I've been harder on you than I should have been. I suppose I expected more from you because you were the oldest, because you were supposed to set an example. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing what you did right and only saw where you disappointed me. And that's my failure, not yours. I'm sorry. I never learned how to tell you that. Your father." The card was dated, signed, sealed in its envelope, but he'd never mailed it, never given it to my father. It had just sat in that drawer for 15 years, this apology that never found its voice. I gave it to my father last month, on what would have been my grandfather's 85th birthday. We sat on the porch of the house, his childhood home, my new home, and I handed him the envelope. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He couldn't say it, my father said finally. He could write it, but he couldn't say it. Does that make it less meaningful? I asked. No, my father said. It makes it more sad. To know he felt this and couldn't speak it. To know we could have had something different if he'd just been able to voice it. He was proud of you, I said. That's what matters. It would have mattered more if I'd known it while he was alive. I know. We sat quietly for a while, listening to the birds, watching the afternoon light slant across the garden. The same porch where my grandfather used to smoke his pipe and tell me about the stars. The same view he'd seen for 50 years. But I have it now, and that's something. It's not everything, but it's something. That's become my father's philosophy, I think. It's not everything, but it's something. It's not the redemption he wanted, but it's enough to build peace on. It's not the family story he hoped for, but it's the true one, and there's value in truth. I think about that letter I found, the one we buried at their graves, and I think about this card my grandfather wrote, but never sent. I think about all the words that went unsaid in my family, all the forgiveness that stayed locked inside proud hearts, all the love that couldn't find its way past old hurts. And I think about how I'm trying to live differently, how I'm trying to say the things that matter while there's still time, how I'm trying to forgive quickly and love openly and let go of disappointments before they calcify into something permanent. I call my father often. I tell him I'm proud of him. I tell him he's a good man. I tell him I love him. Simple words, but they matter. They matter more than I knew. I tell my mother, thank you for staying, for loving, for choosing my father every day, even when it was hard. I tell her she's stronger than she knows. And I talk to my grandmother and grandfather sometimes too, out loud when I'm alone in this house. I tell them I understand a little better now. I tell them I wish things had been different. I tell them I'm trying to learn from their mistakes, to be better at forgiveness, to be quicker to speak love while there's still time to hear it. I don't know if they hear me. I don't know if there's anything beyond this life where regrets can be mended and apologies can be offered and forgiveness can be given freely. But I speak the words anyway, because speaking them helps me, because naming the hurt and the love together is its own kind of healing. Last week, I made my grandmother's apple pie for a church potluck. Someone asked me for the recipe, and as I was writing it down, I realized something. The recipe itself was simple. Flour, butter, apples, sugar, cinnamon. Basic ingredients that most people have. But the way my grandmother taught it to me, there was something extra. A technique in how you mix the dough, a specific way of slicing the apples, little details that made all the difference. That's what she gave me, really. Not just recipes, but attention, time, patience, the gift of being seen and known and loved without condition. And that was real, even if her treatment of my father was also real. Both things existed. Both things mattered. And I'm learning that maybe that's what family is, a collection of contradictions held together by blood and history and choice. People who hurt each other and love each other, sometimes in the same breath. Stories that are complicated and painful and beautiful all at once. My father set the letter down and looked at me. I'm sorry you had to find this. I'm sorry you had to learn that your grandparents weren't the people you thought they were. They were exactly the people I thought they were, I said. They were kind and loving and generous. They were also hurt and stubborn and unable to let go of old wounds. People are complicated, Dad. They can be both things at once. I don't know if I can forgive them for this, he said quietly. You don't have to decide that right now. You don't have to decide that ever if you don't want to. But you forgive them, he said. It wasn't a question. I thought about it. About my grandmother teaching me to bake, about my grandfather showing me the stars, about golden summers and Sunday dinners, and love that was real even if it wasn't perfect. I'm working on it, I said honestly. I'm trying to understand how people can love you and hurt you at the same time. How they can be wonderful to a child and cold to their own son. How they can plan something cruel and then change their minds. I don't have it figured out yet. My father nodded. Your mother said you were talking to Linda and Beth. I wanted to understand. I needed to know the whole story. And now you do. Now you know your father is the family disappointment. Now I know my father is a man who made hard choices and lived with the consequences. That's different. He picked up the letter again. What should I do with this? What do you want to do with it? He thought for a long time. I want to burn it. I want to pretend I never saw it. I want it to not exist. Then burn it. But if I burn it, it feels like I'm hiding from the truth, and I've spent enough of my life pretending things were different than they were. Then keep it. I don't want to keep it. I don't want this in my house, this proof that even after death they wanted to punish me. I understood. I felt the same way. The letter was like poison, like a curse. It changed everything and nothing at the same time. What if we buried it? I said suddenly. My father looked at me. What? What if we went to their graves and we buried it? We acknowledge what it says. We don't hide from it, but we also don't let it live in our homes. We give it back to them. We let them keep their anger and their unforgiveness, and we walk away from it. My father stared at me. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was real. That's a good idea, Charlie girl. That's a really good idea. We sat there a while longer, until we heard my mother's car in the driveway. My father quickly wiped his face, straightened his shoulders. 40 years of hiding pain doesn't disappear in one conversation. My mother came in carrying Chinese takeout. I thought nobody would feel like cooking, she said, looking between us. Are you both okay? We're working on it, my father said. He stood and took the bags from her, kissed her forehead. Thank you for giving us time. Always, she said. She looked at me. You okay, sweetheart? Yeah, Mom, I'm okay. We ate dinner together, the three of us. We didn't talk about the letter. We talked about normal things. The hardware store, the library, what was blooming in the garden. But it felt different now. Lighter somehow, like a pressure had been released. After dinner, my father walked me to my car. Saturday morning. Let's do it Saturday morning, early, before anyone else is at the cemetery. Okay,